All right. With that, I would like to go ahead and just thank you all for being here this day. I'm going to keep admitting people onto the call as I'm speaking. We're so thankful that you have joined us for this lunchtime conversation, the first of many. Grief is something that we all endure, and often we do not feel as though it's appropriate to talk about it. But today we're going to begin talking about it. In Martha Hickman's book, Healing After Loss, she writes, "I will embrace my life, all of it. If there are changes for the better that I can make, I will try to make them. Where I cannot, I will accept that too. But even if I could, I will not forget my pain. I will honor it. It is part of who I am." We have the privilege of hearing from Barb Petsel today, who will talk to us about just that, how to honor who we are in correspondence with grief. Barb is a, sorry. Barb is a licensed professional counselor, a fellow in thanatology, which is the end of life and grief issues. She's a former ICU as well as hospice nurse. She's nationally board certified counselor in grief and end of life issues. She's a workshop provider, a consultant, a group facilitator. Her past experiences in group work are greatly varied, from elder care support, survivors of suicide, loss of child grief support, loss of spouse, parenting groups, groups with homeless shelters, peer support for graduate students, terminal illness support, and elder care support, as well as self-empowerment groups. She's done volunteer work, speaking and working with groups in Zambia, Tanzania, and Sri Lanka. Barb brings to us today incredible wisdom, as well as gets us ready to begin our monthly faith and grief gathering lunches, which will begin next week on Wednesday at this time. I encourage you to sign up if you've not done so already, and I will drop the link to the Faith and Grief website in case you have not been able to find that. Today's talk is called Rising from the Ashes of Grief. So I invite you to settle in as Barb delivers her insights on the subject of grief with warmth and tenderness, while also offering hope, encouragement, and strategies for living with grief. Thank you so much, Barb, for being here today. I have asked you to unmute, so if you don't mind unmuting. There we go.
Sorry about that. Okay, thank you for your kind introduction. It's an honor to be here. I'm going to share my screen. Yes?
Yes.
And so I'll push that, push this. I'm not that techie. And we'll see if we can do it, and go ahead. My name is Barb Petsel, and it's an honor to talk to people about grief. And I just really am excited to be here because I wanted to share some of the things that would have helped me years ago when I was grieving myself. So I'm going to, let me see how to, I'm trying to figure out how to move there we go. First off, who is the expert on your grief? I want to make sure, and I say this before almost every talk that I give, that the expert in your grief is always you. You know more about you. You know more about your relationship than anyone else. So it doesn't matter about the commonality of experiences. It doesn't matter about the initials after someone's name. You are really the expert on your own grief. And I really like to put that out there first thing to make sure that you know. And that you know that I know. When we have a death, it can discombobulate us. But first, I really meant to mention at the first, and this is important to me, that what I share with you is not something I've studied and gotten from one book or whatever. It's from a lifetime of experiences of learning from the experts, which are y'all. I've learned from people in my groups. I've learned when I was a program director and had groups from children that were 3 to 18. I've learned from people who were terminally ill on their bed. I've learned from caregivers and from my own experience. But those are the experts with whom I've been honored to learn from. And that is the knowledge that I really want to share with you today. When someone dies, there's that Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And of course, it starts with physiological needs and goes all the way up to self-actualization. But when we have someone die that is close to us and we've had a really close relationship with them, it's like this whole thing is dismantled. And that's why it's great to have that casserole brigade or people bring you meals, because quite frankly, when people are grieving, a lot of times we don't hydrate ourselves because our normal responses in our bodies for thirst or hungry do not kick in. We're so overwhelmed emotionally that we don't do that. So it's good to take care of ourselves physiologically and to realize that it's okay to depend on other people and give ourselves a break on how we're eating and how we're drinking, but try and when people offer you food, take them up on it. It's really a nice thing to have. Another thing I want to make sure that I clarify is the difference when I refer to grief and mourning. Grief is that feeling inside, that tenderness in your chest that just sort of feels like a heavy weight at times. It's that feeling of yearning when you see people. It's all the emotions, and there are millions of emotions with grief that happen just in the matter of a few minutes. Mourning on the outside, on the other hand, is externally grieving. It can be going to a funeral. It can be sharing stories about your loved one. It can be doing something in honor of your loved one. It can be going to a grief support group like the group that's going to be next week. The research shows over and over again that people who mourn and get it out, and it doesn't have to be with a group, it can be by themselves, as opposed to just trying to stay busy or not feel the feelings or clamp themselves down, actually process and integrate the grief better than those people who try and avoid it or clamp down or carry on as if nothing had happened. So we really want to incorporate ways that we can mourn when we're grieving, because it really helps process it within us. There's a difference between grieving and mourning, but I think there's also a difference. I hear of many people saying recovery, or are you over it yet? Grief is something that's going to be with you for a lifetime. This relationship with this person that's significant will always be with you for a lifetime, but you can have it reconciled, or you can integrate it into living. It's not just done. And sometimes it will come up back and forth in different parts of your life. If you have a child that's getting married and your spouse is not there, it will trigger your grief. But reconciliation and integration is how I like to focus on grief. Wolfelt has a rule of thirds, and I love this. And I did not know this because when my dad died and I was pregnant with one of my children, I thought people would be more caring and they'd understand things better. But I had different people's responses catch me off guard. And maybe that's happened with you as well. For example, he says there's this rule of third. There's a third of the people that are trying the best they can to support you, but they look like deer in headlights when they're around you, and their feet are sort of going the opposite directions, like they want to be out of there as soon as possible. One third will be trying their best because they hate to see you suffering and their intent is really good, but they give you different cliches or they tell you how to do your grief according to their way. And it can be a little bit annoying, even though their intention is with care and kindness. But there is that one third where people do pay attention and can sit with you in your puddle and let you tell your story and be with you without trying to push you or pull you back, and that really care and are comfortable enough with suffering that they can do this. The reason people have different ways of responding to you has so much to do with their past experience with suffering. And with some people, they've gotten comfortable with it or they've experienced it enough that they know what you need and they allow you to be you in your suffering. Other people don't know what to say and their anxiety goes up and they want to go out. I had a friend of mine whose wife had died, and he went to the grocery store, and he said that he saw a neighbor and waved at her and saw her one aisle over, and he went the other aisle, and she'd left her basket. In fact, she'd left the entire store because she didn't know what to say. So often we can feel abandoned by our friends or feel like they're putting something on us, and we have to realize they're trying the best they can to support us, but some people just don't get it. So that takes me on to GIs and DGIs, and you go, what in the heck is that, Barbara? GIs are the get-its. They really understand grief, or they have enough empathy that they've been there and have great understanding of it. And they will say things like, gee, I know this is hard. Tell me about what's going on, or tell me a story about your loved one. The DGIs mean well, their intentions are good, but they really don't get it. These are the people that avoid us or say cliches like, where everything turns out for the best, or sometimes people will say cliches about, well, they were suffering and they're gone now, and maybe you want them there, but you're missing them, and that doesn't help you at that time. It's different if it comes from the griever saying these things, and that's totally fine. But from well-meaning people giving advice, it can be a little bit annoying. And sometimes in my groups, we have GI stories of people who really understand. Someone brought a pot of soup and put it by the front door and called someone and said, I just want you to know it's there. And DGI stories when people well-meaningly will say things that are a little bit irritating at times, or very much full of advice on how to do grief according to their way. It's important to realize, and I didn't realize within this when I first grieved, that there's no timeline. It's a process. Sometimes you can go forward, sometimes you go backwards, but it's movement that's really important instead of just shutting down. So people will sometimes try to help people clean their closets or push them to do that when they're not ready. And the person needs to self-advocate and say, no, that's not me. Taking off rings is another thing. It's an individual decision. You can make that decision whatever you want to do, and there's not a right or wrong with this. I had one person that left her wedding rings on for a year, and then she had a ceremony with her children where they read her wedding vows, and when they said to death do us part, she took them off, and then she put her wedding rings on a necklace, and that was right for her. I have other friends who have taken off their rings when they've become a widow or widower. I've had people that still keep them on. It is not a right or wrong, and we need to realize that that is just your decision, and it's personal, and you cannot make the wrong decision, but you can make the right decision for you. Boundaries are really important too with grieving. I found when I was having a private counseling practice that people well-meaning would intrude on the boundaries of those people that were grieving, and sometimes it took a lot of emotional energy for people to be able to step up and say, no, this doesn't work well for me. So there's two types of boundaries. There's containment boundaries where you pull yourself in and you don't get into other people's hula hoops, because I refer to boundaries as hula hoops. For example, I have a daughter-in-law who's a vegetarian. I would not push her having meat or doing something with meat. If I have a friend that had died, I would not push my way of grieving onto them. So I have to pull and contain my boundaries so that I don't interfere in their hula hoops. Another thing is the protection. And protection is where we put some limits on how people can give us advice or what they're doing for us. Sometimes you want to go to a party, sometimes you don't want to go to a party. Sometimes you want to go to a family gathering, and sometimes you don't want to go to a family gathering. And there's not a right or wrong, but you just need to make sure that you're self-advocating for what you want and consider all the possibilities. One thing I have had seen that people have a challenge with is wording things. For example, I had someone whose family came in. They said, well, we need to just clean out all their stuff and get rid of all their stuff. And they kept pushing this on her. And so finally she said this formula: when I experience words trying to push me to do something I don't want to do, I feel frustrated. We don't say you make me because we got to just say feelings. I prefer being allowed to make my own decisions. Or when I experience someone pushing for me to go to a party or telling me I shouldn't go to a party, either way, I feel really frustrated. I prefer to make my decisions. I prefer to do X, Y, Z. Sometimes we need to have a formula for how to put up boundaries without saying the word you in it. Sometimes people will well-meaning go, you're going to the party no matter what, we're going to just drag you there. And then you have to add the additional thing, or I will need to just leave and go in my own car and leave this area. So it's not a right or wrong, but it's really important to self-advocate for what you want. One thing that's helpful to me that I've seen over and over with groups is they find a lot of people that are the GIs or the get-its regarding grief. And this can be so helpful because all of a sudden you realize a lot of the feelings or frustrations that you have are not just yours alone, but they're shared with other people. So it's important that you find a tribe of people who get it in some way. It could be a grief support group. It could be a group of friends. It could be a group that you get together. It could be an online group, whatever you want to. One person, Kenneth Doka, who used to be in charge of the Hospice Foundation for the United States or something like that. He said that if you make a list of all your friends and write down your whole list of friends, and then you put a D for those people that are really doers. These are people that can help you clean out a closet. These are people that can find repair persons for you. They're doers, and put a D beside each one of those people. Then go through your list and find out which ones are listeners that really can listen without giving you a bunch of advice, and put an L beside those people. And then there are those people that there's no way in heck that they're going to discuss grief, and you can put an R for respite. Sometimes you can go out with them to a movie or a concert, and there's no way that they're going to talk about grief. So they're almost like a respite person that you can go out and have a break away from grief, and that is helpful. And if you're religious, sometimes I will put a P beside those people that can be prayer partners when you're going through a difficult time and you want to have a person that you can confide on that can list it and remember you in prayers if that's of your faith. Self-advocacy is difficult when you're emotionally overwhelmed, but it really does help and makes you feel more empowered, because there's so many ways that you're losing power that you go, oh my goodness, this is not the way it was. And it truthfully is not. But being proactive and setting up your boundaries on what you want and don't want and how you want people to best assist you is really helpful and mentally helpful. A lot of people will come up to you and say, well, how are you doing? And when this happened to me, I'd go, oh, how am I doing? And then I go, what am I supposed to say? And I try and create something each time someone asked me. But I found out that those people who had if I feel good, this is what I'm going to say. And if I don't feel good and I'm having a hard day, this is what I'm going to say instead. For example, if someone came up to me and said, well, how are you, Barb? And I'm grieving, and I go, today's a fairly good day and I'm doing okay. And that's how I wanted my script to go. But if I'm having a bad day, I could go, today's really a rough day, but tomorrow's a new day. They did research on people and how they responded to how people respond when you say, how are you? And it's been a negative day. And those people that put the caveat of some hopefulness for another day in the future or a future time and saying, I'm struggling now, but it's just today, tomorrow's a new day, or something that shows hopefulness. Actually, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy and they could do better in the long run. I think it's really important to be authentic and say how you're doing. Maybe not to the grocery clerk that's at the store, because you don't have a deep relationship with them. But when people ask you how you're doing, be proactive and I'm going to say this when I have a good day and this when I have a really bad day, so that you don't have to go in your heart and try and create something all of a sudden. That can be really difficult. Also, for those people who've lost a child, so many people unknowingly about the death will come up and say, well, how many children do you have? It's an innocent question, but they don't know how it triggers you if you've had a child die. So if you come up with, if someone asks me this question, I'm going to say I had 3 children and 2 are living. I have 3 children and 1 died, or I just have 2 children. There's no right or wrong. But if you can go, okay, this is my go-to response for just an automatic response, it causes less stress for you because you're not having to create that. So many people, including myself, when we've had a death of someone, go through woulda, coulda, shoulda. If I'd recognized the symptoms earlier, maybe the diagnosis would have been caught earlier and they wouldn't have died. Maybe if I hadn't turned around when we were driving, I could have done X, Y, Z. We go through a woulda, coulda, shoulda. And I found this almost true for every person that had a death. And it was interesting, and I was talking to another therapist friend of mine, and I said, have you noticed that? And she said, yes. She said, in fact, we did research and found out when you create a story about something with a beginning and a middle and end, and say it repetitively to yourself, it becomes almost truth. And the reason why we want to do that creation of that story is because we want to control our future. We want to control our life, and we don't want to be out of control. But the truth of the matter is we're not in control of the world. And the truth of the matter, we can't control things. Even if we had one problem come up and that was the only problem for the whole day. And of course, that's not realistic at all. So we create a story about maybe we could have done something that would have prevented the outcome. And then the more repetitively we say it, the more truthful. But the truth is, life happens, death happens, and we're not in control of the world. And we just have to realize that. So what do we do about all this if we want to be in control and we're not in control? And the most important thing is to be self-compassionate. Self-compassion has 3 things with it. One is self-kindness versus self-judgment. This is even true when you lose your car keys or whatever when you're grieving. If we talk to ourselves, and quite frankly, I talk to myself internally, oh my gosh, I used to just rage at myself. You idiot, you lost your keys. You're maybe grieving, but I can't believe you lost your keys. And I just rant on myself. I would never, never, never talk to anyone else that way. But it's important for me to stop and talk to myself internally the same way I would talk to a friend. You can do this. Take a deep breath. You're going to find the keys. It's not the end of the world. And to do it that way. Or like when my mother died, it's like you tried the best you could with what you knew at the time. And things happen that are sometimes out of our control. The next part is the common humanity versus isolation, to realize we are all human and we're not all together. Excuse me, my printer's going off. Let me turn it off. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Someone else has a control of my printer too. So it's important to realize this moment. Hey, Marvin, don't print. Don't print. So I apologize. So it's important to have common humanity and realize we're all human. We all make mistakes. We're all imperfect. Things happen. And to realize that we all belong together and we all have connections together instead of isolation. The third part is mindfulness over versus over-identification. When we're going and we feel really uptight to go, what is going on right now? I'm feeling upset. I'm feeling frustrated, but not go, I'm a frustrated, angry person. It's just that you're feeling those feelings. So when we act on self-compassion, we're kind to ourselves, verbally, non-verbally, and our actions in so many different ways. It's important to realize people grieve very differently, and there's not a right or wrong to it at all. Some people are instrumental grievers. They're doers. For example, I have a friend of mine whose dad died, and he made a gravestone out of a propeller. He worked on that all the time, and he was doing something, and that's a doer. When I used to announce people in the middle of the night with hospice, I would go there and I'd have someone on the couch, inevitably, who was crying and very upset, and someone else that was trying to get the obituary together and the notes together and all that. And the person who was very emotional would go, look, they're just doing things. They're not grieving. And the person who was grieving would go, look at this other person. They're falling apart. What's the matter with them? Neither one was wrong. They just were grieving in the style that they are used to doing for themselves. The instrumentals are doers, and some people do a lot more than feel their feelings as much. And some people are very emotional and express their emotions very strongly. And then there's blends all the way through. It's not a right or wrong. In fact, it's fascinating. With one of my groups, we go through an exercise where I say, how did your parents grieve, or two friends of yours grieve? Were they instrumental grievers? Were they emotional grievers? Or were they one of the blends? And when they tell us about that, then they're more aware of how they grieve themselves, and they're more tolerant of how other people are grieving as well. There's various relationships and various perspectives, and there's a relationship of a child who loses a parent. You feel like you've lost the person that knows your history from when you were born, and a wife or husband who feels like this is the person I've shared all my decisions with and raising our children together. There's different perspectives of each person, and it brings a different relationship to the ball game. And so to talk about what is the special thing with your relationship that you miss the most. I know with girls who've lost their dads when they're young, a lot of times he's not there to walk me in the wedding that I'm going to have. Or with caretakers or older people, it's like, this is the person I thought that would be there for me when I was ill if a husband or wife dies. Each relationship is different. There's a dual process, and some people think grief just happens where you go down and then come right back up, and that's not how grief works at all. It's just sort of discombobulated, but it basically, there's some research by Stroebe and Shoot, and they show that it oscillates back and forth. You work on grief things, and then after a while you pull back and work on life things, and then you go back to grief, and then you go back to life, and it oscillates back and forth. At first, it may seem like you're much more on the grieving side, but you will go back and forth. There'll be triggers of music or different things that will bring you back to your grief years later. But as you grieve, it becomes more integrated into your life as far as this loss. There's no exact timetable. Everyone goes, well, how long am I going to grieve? And there's not an exact timetable. It all depends on the person, how they're processing it, their support group, their past history. There's not a timetable. But the research has shown over and over again, the more you externalize your grief with journaling, going to groups, reading books, doing things outside of yourself with your grief, telling stories about the person who died is a wonderful way. That seems to take the real acute pain of the grief away after a while, but it often will oscillate back and forth too. Grief bursts are when you are going along the street or going along the store and you're not expecting to grieve at all, and all of a sudden there's a smell that reminds you of a person? What's that cologne? What's the smell of that food that we had that time? And it brings your senses to a halt, and all of a sudden your grief comes up. Or you see a family that's all intact together when your family member is missing. And these grief bursts are very normal. Alan Wolfelt tells the story about that there was a woman in one of his groups whose husband used to kidnap her once a year from work, and he'd arrange with her boss, and he'd take her during the times when this was unusual, to have those chickens on a rotisserie that go round and round. And he'd take her and get lunch and have a picnic with her. Well, he died, and years later, she went out to this little cafe in the country with a friend of hers, and they had those chickens with the rotating parts, and it was going around and around, and she got on her knees and just started crying beside it, and the man in the store rushed out and said, I'm sorry, lady, but we do that to all our chickens. People are going to misunderstand these grief bursts at times. My father was from a German family, and every time I see Braunschweiger in a can, I will get very much emotional about that. Who knew? But sometimes those grief bursts are going to come up, and to be comforting to yourself and to just realize they're passing by, but because you loved hard, you're going to have grief bursts at times too. Sometimes even giving yourself a hug is important, because as mammals, we like warmth and pressure, and it will help your cortisol, which is elevated when you're really scared or anxious or nervous, to lower down when you give yourself a hug. Or you can even give butterfly pats, which is where you go back and forth to the left and right and give pats. And you can do this sometimes, and it can lower that cortisol so it's less anxiety. You can experience all kinds of feelings. People go, well, I'm in the sad stage or I'm in the anger stage. That's really not true at all, because we can have a multiple feelings all during our grief. Some people have a short fuse when they get really into grief, and this is understandable because you're emotionally sort of pinned up and you're trying to keep these emotions under control a little bit, and all of a sudden something comes up and they go, oh, I broke my finger, now it's the end of the world, and you've had someone die, and there's such a contrast to that. So what do you do when you feel angry? There's 3 things I used to tell my clients to do, and of course they'd look at me like, oh my gosh, what kind of therapist do I have here? But it seemed to really work. One is to get a bowl full of ice cubes. And in Texas, you can get this bowl full of ice cubes and just throw them all over the backyard wherever you want to. And you can just throw them all over. No cleanup in Texas. It'll just melt, and that's it. Another thing to do is to get a roll of toilet paper. And for a while, these are treasured items. But when they're not treasured, you can roll out toilet paper and you can draw stick figures of the people that are making you mad, or write the words of things that are making you mad. And then you can wad these up and take them to the toilet and just flush these people right down. And there's something cathartic about this. It sounds a little warped, but it works like a charm if you're really pinned up, because it's externalizing this anger in a healthy way. Alan Klein, who's a humorist, and his wife died years ago, would drive through the highways of California. And he said he would get in this traffic where it was all pulled back and his wife had died, and he'd be sitting there mad and angry and tense. And he kept a bottle of bubbles beside him in his car, and he would take out the bubbles and he would blow them out the window, and they would go up and float above the cars, and people would look at him and start smiling and pointing at it. He said that blowing out just really helped me with my anger. But then seeing everyone smiling and laughing about the bubbles, he said that seemed to help as well. If we can externalize our anger in a way that doesn't harm anyone else, it's a good way to do. It's just natural. We're just people and human, and we can externalize our anger. Wolfelt, who is a prolific writer about grief, and he's a psychologist in Colorado that learned under, said we have to say hello to grief before we can say goodbye. We really don't say goodbye and shut the door. We will say hello to it. So we want to go toward that. There's something I learned recently called the bison effect, and maybe you've heard this, maybe you haven't. But when there's a big storm coming, cattle will lay down a field and just sort of hunker down. and they're let the storm go over them. Bison, on the other hand, will run toward the storm and face their storm because they want the brunt of the storm over more quickly. We have to say hello to grief and embrace it. It doesn't mean we have to 24 hours a day, but we need to embrace some of the grief instead of ignoring it or trying to be busy or trying to keep it in another box far away. We can bring that grief with us periodically, open it up and examine it and embrace the feelings, and therefore it doesn't become ominous to us. It becomes part of our life and part of our sensitivity toward people who are courageous, who face their grief, and people who are suffering. And it gives much more empathy. There's emotional fill-ups, and I call these are important. It's important to write these down when you're feeling good, because if you're feeling bad or down, you're not going to be able to think of anything. These are times that you lose sort of track of time and that you can enjoy it, and that sort of takes you away. For my husband, it would be probably walking through Home Depot. We have a blended family now, and his kids like walking through Home Depot as well. For me, it'd probably be going on Pinterest and exploring that. It could be walking our dogs. It could be going to a bookstore and just roaming around and smelling a coffee shop nearby. Whatever it is that floats your boat, to make a list of 4 or 5 emotional fill-ups that helps you feel a little bit more stabilized, that gives you the power to just sort of take a time out and enjoy yourself. And to keep those around your phone or your house so that when you get feeling down, that you know how to possibly pull yourself up, that you can have some way of anchoring yourself. There's a book I was given one time when I was grieving about thing, and it's about Who Moved My Cheese, and many of you may be familiar with this book. And it was given out of love with this person because I was close to this person. I would not just normally give this to a person, and they probably wouldn't give it to me, but we had a reciprocal relationship that was comfortable. It's about 2 mice, and they go through this maze every day, zip, 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 and they get to the cheese and eat it. And they go next day, zip, 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 cheese, eat it. Next day, zip, 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 cheese. And they get into this pattern of every day getting their cheese going the regular way. But one day, zip, 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 the cheese is not there. It's like, oh, crumb. And one sits there and goes, this is not the way it's supposed to be. I did my zip, 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 and the cheese is gone. What happened? It should be here. And they both discuss and say, it should be here. We did the same thing. What's the matter with this? And then finally, after a day or so of sitting there, one goes, well, let me look around, and starts wandering around and finds a little bit of morsels in another place. The other one stays there and goes, the cheese ought to be here. I did my zip, zip, zip. It's the same thing every day. I deserve the cheese. I deserve it. It should be here. I did exactly what I'm supposed to do. I did the same thing. This is totally unfair. They gave this to me when I was going through a grief thing, and I thought, this is just not fair that this happened, and I'm really frustrated with it. But they gave it out of love, and they knew I love stories. I would not recommend giving this to someone, but then when I heard my voice going, this is not fair, it shouldn't have happened, I'm too young for this, all of a sudden I realized I was the mouse that was stuck there, and I need to make a little bit of movement. It's important not to look at the whole staircase, but just to look at the next step. And sometimes you're going to go 1 step forward and 2 back, or 2 steps forward and 1 back. But just to look, what is one thing I can get accomplished today? What is one thing that I can do that's self-nurturing for my grief in the next day? Sometimes it's baby steps. Sometimes it's giant steps. Sometimes it's backward steps. But to make movement is really important instead of just shutting down and being isolated. Grief is a very difficult journey. There is no doubt about it. But with help and with finding and taking just one little step at a time, it becomes a journey, and you can become more engaged in life, more engaged with other people. And it's difficult, and it's painful, and it's hard, but it's so worth it. What to do about special days comes up all the time, and I think this is an important aspect to talk about during this talk, because like Mother's Day is coming up, Father's Day is coming up. Maybe you've had a mother or father die, or maybe a spouse, or maybe you've had a child die and you're no longer have that child living. I think it's important to proactively plan something for that day. It can be anything that you want it to be. Sometimes I've had people get together and they plan a gathering of their friends, and they get small rocks like about this size, and they write on the outside of the rock a quality that the person had that died, and they put it by a candle, and everyone tells a story, and then they gather up those rocks and gives it to the relative that's the closest relative. And that can be wonderful. They can put in those glass vases that are clear, or they can make a part of the garden for those, whatever they want to. Sometimes I've had people go to restaurants that the person enjoyed. I've had people, my husband's first wife died from a brain tumor, so we'd go on a brain tumor walk each year to earn money for brain tumor research. There's not a right or wrong about it. It's just trying to do something that honors that day instead of dreading the day. It's like, I'm going to shut down, stay at home, and I'm going to ignore that day because it's so painful. It could be as little as making a phone call to a friend and just saying, let's both share stories about this loved one we had. It could be going on a walk by yourself. A friend of mine whose son had died years ago often goes to a restaurant on the day of Mother's Day, and she will see some family that has maybe one child that's the age her son would have been, and she buys their restaurant bill for them and pays for it secretly. And for her, that works. I've had people go through a drive-in like Jack in the Box or whatever and pay for the person behind them. It doesn't matter as long as we can face these. Some of my clients when I had a private practice would go, oh, I just don't know whether we can talk about it. So I wrote a book about a child who is not allowed to talk about the person who died very much. And she goes to a neighbor and complains about this. And the neighbor sends her home with a little brown paper bag. And in the brown paper bag, she puts it on the kitchen table, and her dad goes, what's this? And he opens up the bag, and there's a plastic elephant inside. And she goes, that's a plastic elephant, but it's about the elephant in the room. Do you know what an elephant in the room is? And he goes, yeah. And she goes, it's like with grandma, nobody wants me to talk about grandma, and I want to talk about grandma. And then he said, what else is in this bag? And he pulls out some pipe cleaners is what I call them. Some people call them fuzzy sticks now because of the smoking thing. But anyway, I call them pipe cleaners. And she said, the neighbor told me that if we start bending them in shapes that reminds them of memories with grandma and talk about those, it will help. So they all bend them in shapes and stuff. One bent them in the shape of a cookie, one bent them in the shape of a hug, and they all began talking. And actually the elephant in the room became smaller and smaller and smaller. We can do things to elicit stories from our friends, but sometimes the ones who are grieving has to make that initial step. When my dad died and I had in-laws over and all these people over, I thought surely they're talking about my dad, and they never mentioned it because at that time they thought they were protecting me. But I would have loved to hear stories about my father. I've had 2 nieces and a nephew die, and I would love to celebrate their lives with stories as well. Try and be creative and come up with whatever works for you. Just a few things to add here. Clothing or objects have added meaning. I had a guy that had his wife die, and he loved having a pink pair of heels in his closet with his wife's pink purse. He cleared everything else, but he said, somehow that gives me comfort. My friends say, oh, get rid of it. But to me, it's comforting. And the group that we were with at that time said, keep it in the closet if it helps to you. Some people feel like they're going crazy if they're talking to the deceased about, I wish you were here about this decision with the kids, and this is what's going on. That's normal. A lot of people talk to the deceased as though they're there. And our identity changes in some ways, not our personality, but our identity on who we are, and we become more who we are as far as the essence. If you were a couple beforehand, all of a sudden you're becoming a single. We're going from we and us to me and I. If you're a sister, all of a sudden, instead of having several siblings, you have one less sibling. If you have a mother die, you had a motherless daughter, it can be really difficult, and there's not words for it like orphan or widow for some of the things, but there's still very difficult things to go through. But your identity will change, but you can become more powerful and more who you are as you progress and integrate your grief into living. One person told me, it was a neonatal nurse, what it was important to say, is that sometimes people who lose a baby will sometimes complain of hearing a cry of a baby in the middle of the night because they've anticipated this so much. And I found out when I talked to several people that this was really true. And some people who have lost a baby will say their arms ache because they're so anticipating holding that baby that sometimes as a physiological symptom, sometimes our arms will ache with that. Those are new things, but I think it's understanding and being self-compassionate about all the symptoms you have with grief and just realizing they're part of our humanity. Self-talk is really important. I am imperfect and enough is one of the sayings from Brene Brown. I love that because I am as imperfect as you can get. And I use that when I really mess up. And I think it's important that we talk to ourselves with gentleness, the same you would talk with somebody else. So if you misplace things or miss an appointment, I had people miss appointments occasionally when they were grieving because they were so overwhelmed with their emotions. And just as self-talk, I'm human, it happened, I've called, I've done the best I can, circle back and do the best you can and then try and let go of it. Grief gardening is something new I've heard of recently. I heard that people who are grieving, that gardening out in the yard really helps. First off, dealing with the soil helps your endorphins to be increased, and that's where you feel self-good, and your cortisol gets decreased, where that goes up when you feel anxious, anxiety. So grief gardening, it can be planting new seeds, seeing new life, seeing possibilities, being in control of something small. That can be helpful. Your identity is going to change, but you can become a more sensitive, deeper, caring person. The people that I know in my groups and in my practice that I had, they have a special compassion and sensitivity and a depth of understanding what's important and what's not important with life. And making meaning, this is one of the most significant things of all, that if you can make meaning of your life in some way and go forward, this person that died was very, very dear to me, but I'm going to honor them by how I'm going to live. I'm going to honor them by how I embrace my life and living. That is really important. My husband's my first wife with the brain tumor, we try and do things for brain tumor research. Um, I think it's really important just to act with something and realizing you are alive here. You can make meaning from having known this person. I've had people that go to dog shelters and donate equipment when their children who had died loved animals. It can be anything where you make meaning. And enlarge your world by making your loss meaningful for you, and by helping other people as well. This could be in a grief group. Just saying something to another member of the grief group can be monumental. You never know how a few words of kindness can be interpreted. I have a ball here. I don't know whether you can see it, but to see that ball in the picture is the one that I have in here. And it's life. Grief is going along, and life is this multicolored thing, and grief touches everything. And then as you learn to do something for yourself, like when I was by myself, it's like fixing an air conditioner filter, or the first time I've gone to a show by myself, or the first time you go to a similar place that you went with your loved one, or the first time you have stories about your loved one, your world gets bigger. And it's not that your grief goes away, but it becomes the less center of your world and it doesn't touch everything. You have become bigger, but you've embraced the grief and you honor the grief. But it doesn't have to touch every aspect of your life. I want to tell a quick story at the end, or a quote at the end, but I really want to stop right now and give you time for questions for a moment.
Hi, Barb.
Hello, Brian.
Hi. I work with Rachel Meltzer.
Oh, yes.
So fondly.
One of my favorite people.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm curious if you could share a little bit about maybe the factors that contribute to complicated grief.
Oh, I think there's a lot of, with complicated grief, it can be the relationship that they've had before the person died. Maybe it was that you wish the relationship had been better, or you wish certain things had been said, or you wish that person had been there for you more. There's also complicated grief with suicide and with homicide and with accidental deaths. It can become very, very difficult. I had a relative of mine, a grandfather, die of suicide when I was about 12. And nobody told me at that time, and there's ways you can tell a child that's developmentally appropriate, and you can call me privately and I will be glad to share that. I don't want to take up the time with that. But a lot of times people have so many questions with that, or an overdose or a homicide, and it can be like, we never got to finish the chapter, or we would have finished it differently. Sometimes it can be complicated when the person's not encouraged to grieve their own way and they're trying to please other people or do grief according to how their family of origin had grief. There's so many different complications that can cause grief to be complicated in its own way. And some of it's traumatic, and so it's important to deal with those with a therapist that's dealt with trauma. Some of it is because of the relationship. There's so many factors, and I could give a whole hour talk on that, but I just wanted to acknowledge that sometimes grief is not simple, and we need help from therapists like from Brian or other people. And it can be complicated even when it doesn't seem complicated to other people. It's all in your perspective on what you see as it being that way. But I think it takes so much courage to reach out and get the help you deserve and to get the support you need. And if you go to one person or one group and it doesn't work out, try another one. We try and coordinate a bunch of different resources. Next week, they're going to have this Faith and Grief luncheon. That's a great opportunity to talk to people who can discuss things after a speaker has spoken, and they have small discussion groups too. Good question. Thank you. I want to close with a quote that I think is important, if you would indulge me to read, and I apologize for reading, but I can't remember this that well by myself. What if the hole in your heart is an opening in the heart, not to be filled in, but a place of stretching, a space where our capacity to love grows, a place that serves us best when it stays a little bit tender, and that tenderness keeps us awake to what loving and being loved is, awake to what the people who are no longer here mean to us, awake to the feelings of others who will also experience loss, a place from which memories arise of their gifts to us and their time with us, a place that is actually a space for growth. This person, Rose Gordon, says her memories of our loved one are joyful, poignant, and occasionally heart-wrenching, and they give rise to new insights over the years, new appreciations, and new perspectives. She said, I think we all agree there is a hole, an opening created by loss and grief. And what we do with it makes all the difference in the world. I think the phrase wounded healer refers to the wholeness and the healing that is created from allowing our hearts to break open and then bringing that wholeness into our lives and taking it everywhere we go. May you embrace your grief, but realize that life is worth living and there are so many great things you can do, because you don't want to have this knowledge of grief, but with it, you have extra empathy about suffering, a deepness for life, and a reverence for living. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barb. We so appreciate you being with us today.
My pleasure.